Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
And here we are. This episode, featuring a new guest, an interesting perspective, a young friend of mine I've had many discussions with. I wish I had recorded them all. This one is perhaps sort of an introduction. It takes us a little while to get going. It's a little meandering. I really enjoy speaking with him, and I hope you'll enjoy this conversation and that it will be considered kind of a teaser for more conversations to come. He has requested that he go by the name of Charlotte Ann, which of course we will immediately recognize as not being the case in more than one way. Nevertheless, I respect that decision, and so I am pleased to introduce Charlotte Ann in his first podcast appearance. Enjoy. It seems like, the whole gangster thing.
Oh, yeah, like I do what I want.
Yeah.
I mean,
romanticization.
Someone told me an awesome joke just recently. What's the difference between a hippie and a redneck?
Okay, what's that?
10 years.
That's pretty good. Interesting, yeah.
I was like, yeah, well, it all came up because I was talking about my kind of transition from like being very concerned about my, food purchasing choices and the ethics of the foods I was buying. And then Trump got elected and I was just like, you know what? I'm poor and like, I'm just going to buy shit food because it doesn't make me feel that much worse. And like, I just need to save some fucking money. And like, I don't think my ethical choices aren't going to have any impact now that Trump is president.
I'm not sure they would have either beforehand, right?
Yeah, but I was young and I was like, oh, it's totally cool that I like, pay $50 a month for rent and I'll, just dumpster most of my food and then pay like $35 for like olive oil that's organic that came from Palestine, because that's like fucking really ethical choice.
Well, yeah, I guess there was this strange notion that somehow or another we'd be able to salvage this civilization by making good purchasing decisions. Right. Because basically freedom got whittled down to being nothing but about purchasing decisions.
Right. It's the politics of money.
And like,
it's kind of like recycling.
The dismal outcome of the social revolutions, I think, put a real damper on the idea that people could take action and it would be like, it would lead to a better world.
Right. Or like even if you become communist, eventually you're still going to get roped back into the world economy, and then you're going to be at a disadvantage,
I guess there's that you sort of be falling behind because it's all this gigantic competitive race to the bottom.
Race to the bottom.
So it's like,
oh, hell.
You can end up last right now, or you could, enter the fray and go for a run for a bit and
give your riches to the right person.
Right.
The world will be a better place.
That's the other thing, too, is that, not just our individual purchasing decisions, but that somehow or another, if, like, money were spent on something, that it would solve the problem. Like, if only government would just allocate the right amount of money to various programs. I mean, there's definitely a lot of truth to the idea that a lot of money is wasted. Right, but the question as to whether or not you can solve a problem by allocating funds, I'm not so sure. I mean, I'm sure that there are some programs that are more effective than others, but in general, there is this notion that if we throw money at something, it will solve a problem, and that obviously isn't true.
I don't know. I haven't seen the money thrown around in person. It's just talked about, so can't speak from personal experience. I mean, I'm way more on that side than the other side. Yeah.
What's the other
Or
side?
people are always like telling me to like try to get a grant, And I'm
Right.
like, does that actually like work out for people? Like everyone I know who's like gotten a grant is like, man, I couldn't do anything that I wanted because I was on their program. As soon as I, got the money, and then they paid 15% of my project, but then they like called all the shots on like, how I was going to operate. I'm thinking mostly like people who got greenhouse,
Right.
help and
Right.
it's like, okay, this is how you're going to do it. This is the protocol. And then I don't know exactly what those farmers wanted to do that was so different than the program, but that was the general vibe I got.
Well, that is also another thing that I think we're seeing kind of the byproduct of is the distance between the experts and the people who are in the field, and I guess like both sides have their valid points, but it does seem that unless you spend a lot of time in the field, the expertise tends to become very theoretical and not particularly grounded.
Right.
And we can see that happening, from everything agriculture to foreign policy,
Right.
There are a lot of ivory towers where people have careers that are very well paid, that come up with policy recommendations that are followed for many, many years that produce disastrous results for most of us. We're going to have a lot of dog background.
It's like, it's great though, because it's like, you're talking about some juicy stuff, and then there's like the sound of salivation. Yeah, the top down or bottom up. It's like, it seems like you gotta find some middle ground, because on the same token, it's like the people on the ground oftentimes are so delusional about, the responsibilities of the top guys making the decision. Is like, as bad as their decision making is, they also, it's the distance creates a dynamic where both parties are understanding of what each other do is just like so full of projections that may or may not be sound.
Right. Because, obviously there are periods of time where people who are accustomed to doing things a certain way are kind of out of step with what's going on. So you could say that there is a tendency on the ground to kind of go with inertia and just do things the way that they've been done.
Right.
Which has a set of problems in and of itself. But, quite often these systems are set up for good reasons. So, you tamper with that stuff at your peril, but it does seem like quite often the newfangled way of going about doing things just doesn't turn out to be quite as awesome as it was presented to be. But there are, sort of inexorable forces at play in history that keep changing things, changing the way things are done. And quite often they're for reasons that have nothing to do with what the concern is on the ground.
Right. It's like, it's almost like economic growth. If you're not changing, you're going to get lost in the sands of time. Like if you're not growing, then you're like failing.
But so much of that also, I think, is based on basically a rapacious model, because the whole economic engine is this, eating away at the earth and away at the systems, the natural systems that had produced things in the past without all this technical interference. But now we're increasingly technically interfering with the basic mechanism of life in order to, I guess, meet quotas or kind of ward off potential diseases and crop damage, or you have I think basically domesticated species become weaker. Would you say that that's basically true?
I got to say, I'm actually hung up on the aesthetics of the word rapacious, because I don't hear it spoken out loud, and it's like such a beautiful manifestation of such like a violent, like rape, is just like it's very curt, like verbal experience. But rapacious it's almost like gracious, or like this, I don't know, it just was so sensual when you threw it out there that I just was like,
well, we do talk about the earth as being the great mother, right?
Right.
And so, some people do just come out and say the rape of the earth, and I think that's a pretty accurate metaphor, you could say.
Right. Actually, it's funny because rape is a mythological dynamic. I was just reading about this morning. The book I'm reading is Liz Green's Astrology of Fate, and she's talking about the traditional deities of the underworld in further back in ancient Greece are almost completely feminine, and then there's kind of this transition to like, Hades becomes the lord of the underworld, but even, in that transition, he's more of like a servant to these like female underworld deities like Moira, Triple Face Hecate, but the story of the rape thing is the I guess in a lot of renditions of the Greek myth, Hades only comes to the surface twice during his unending life that's still continuing, maybe, I don't know. But
Probably
one of those is he sees the daughter of Demeter, Persephone, and he wants to claim her as his wife, and the event that precipitates his entrance into the upper world and the rape and abduction of Persephone is she picks a flower. I'm not exactly sure what the flower was, but that the claim of the author is that, this small act of desire and taking is what elicits this, it's in her taking of the ground is responding and rapes and abducts her. And the author's perspective is that there is some part of Persephone, maybe unconscious, that's actually, calling this experience to her. And in the Smith, he abducts her, and then she becomes the queen of the underworld. But then Demeter becomes so upset that she creates winter, and it's unending. And then the gods end up brokering a deal where Penelope spends half the year underground with Hades, and then, or maybe it's a third and 2/3 above, and that's kind of like the beginning of the story of like why winter is.
Yeah.
But it's
there's a little like recapitulation of Eve there, kind of the eating of the forbidden fruit, bringing about evil in some way.
Right. Oh shit, man! This is gonna get real tangential because I also just visited the Wikipedia page summarizing the apocryphon of I'm probably butchering that word pronunciation of John, which is like
Or the Gnostic.
one of the Nag Hammadi texts, and okay, so there's the original, the all-in-all spirit, the holy monad, which, like the aesthetics of the word are like, it sounds like a math word to me, but actually it seems genius because it's like, mon as mono is one, and then ad is like the sum of all things. It's like the one that is the sum of all things. It's like the most appropriate word you could use for the all in all, spirit of all things, and then it's like that creature, or the spirit of all things, self impregnates itself, gives birth to Sophia, the goddess of wisdom or deity of wisdom, and then she begets a son of her own without a male consort or acknowledgement from the holy monad, and she creates this character Yaltabaoth. Again, probably killing the pronunciation, but and this thing's like a serpent with a lion's head, and it's it has a shred of light that's been passed down from Sophia that's like of the holy monad, but she conceals them, and she I don't know if it's her or the Yaltabaoth, or like maybe in cahoots they make this like false underground reality, and he kind of like ends up playing his own holy monad thing where he creates his own world and all his little demons, very much like the Satan kind of story.
Right.
But that at some point, Sophia realizes that she needs to like fess up, and she tells the holy monad what's going on, and then he like speaks some wisdom, blows his breath on the waters that are the ceiling of this false underworld, and in that the Yaltobaoth and his demonic minions see this and they're terrified, but at the same time they're inspired, and they try to create a reflection of this powerful breath they experience on the waters of their world. And okay, this is seeming like really tangential, but it gets back to
Seems like exactly what's happened here on Earth in a way.
well, when I was reading it, I was like, man, this is like the original Matrix, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
Like it's the false, digital world reality. And within that reality is, I don't know if there's like 2 Gardens of Edens, but in this story, which seems like it was a revelation someone brought back from like a really hardcore psychedelic trip or something like that. Or maybe God's just talking to him normal. But that Yaltobaoth creates this false Garden of Eden, and that it's actually Christ who facilitates the act of Eve. It's either Christ is the embodiment of Eve that allows for Adam to pick of the tree of knowledge. And in a sense, I got the impression that like the Christ in this storyline, like a lot of other storylines, he's the conduit between these worlds of false and true, and that he's like the connecting force, and that it was just super meta, because it seems like, okay, so Christ is what is responsible for the act of sin that creates original sin, but maybe it's through maybe this version of this holy story is that like, oh, sin is actually the vehicle for understanding what is good and evil, and that it's like you can't actually have the experience of understanding knowledge until you just go there almost, and you need assistance. Again, I could be like, this is just like a rough Wikipedia read. I could be totally like skewing this and like reinventing it for my own.
Well, I mean, it seems like so much of this ancient, we could call it ancient poetry, I think, right, is so open to interpretation. So what else are you going to do? Is there an authoritative way of envisioning any of these texts? I mean, even within the canon of the sanctioned texts of the Bible, right?
Right.
The Testaments, there's so much interpretation. So that's what we do when we're looking at these messages from the ancient world. That's basically what we're getting. We're getting messages from the ancient world, people who are thinking and seeing things, and we're trying to relate to them because we're an offshoot of all of that. And there's a lot of resonance in what you're talking about. It seems like the idea that at this earliest point, I mean, one of the first things that strikes me is the idea that Sophia would have an offspring that she would protect and hide, which is, I think, a very maternal instinct, right?
Right. Or even, even maternal beyond like the feminine experience, but like, the experience of the creator, is like anything that one creates is like, has some level of sacred and deserving of protection. Or
well, it's also interesting that if she's the avatar of wisdom, that wisdom would have the tendency to produce these false worlds.
Right. Yeah, that seemed like one of the really loaded kind of details of it, was that wisdom in its own right is fallible. It's like, it's not just knowledge that needs guidance, but like even wisdom has its moments of poor judgment.
Well, in a way, you could say that wisdom, I mean, the way I would view it, astrologically speaking, would be the tension between Sagittarius and Gemini. Right.
Ooh, yeah. The knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, like basically the knowledge and wisdom require that there be some kind of consistent story. But there is underlying everything an engine of inconsistency that in a certain sense the basic fabric of existence is outside of wisdom's purview. But wisdom is the best that we can do in terms of being able to get some kind of a grip on it.
Right.
But yeah, by following the path of, let's say, knowledge, because wisdom, I guess, would, I think, incorporate both, you would see.
It's like you have to have the knowledge to formulate a bigger picture or some level of knowledge. But then that's the fallacy is like, if you don't have enough details, your big picture is pretty skewed. But if you have too many details, then you can't quite make a big picture. And, it's that balancing act between the two.
That's true. Yep. But then there's also just the fundamental kind of limit of knowledge, the barriers to perception and understanding that are kind of hard-coded into the universe. I mean, we've done a pretty splendid job, I guess, here on planet Earth of being able to probe the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, but in reality, like, we have just the slightest understanding of what those domains are really about.
We're like, we really got this figured out, and we're just going to have to keep spending 40 plus hours a week sitting in this room looking at this screen, continue to flesh out all these details so we can really live like in the best way. Right. We need more of that. When we hit 60, maybe we'll go home and just stay in that room with the screen. And
well, that describes the condition of what's the name of the offspring of Sophia Baphomet or
Yalto-Baoth.
Yalto-Baoth. Yeah, Baphomet is another devil name, right?
Or
Yalto-Baoth.
Yalto-Baoth.
Okay.
Like Y-A.
Well, I mean,
T-A.
a protected child, right, will always create their own world.
Oh shit! This is like an analogy for me as the only child for the first 7 years of my life. Huh. Well, shit, I didn't think about that one.
Damn, wasn't gonna get personal, but
I also love the imagery too of the lion's head with the snake's body. Is kind of like, especially the lion's head, seems like the embodiment of ego. Huh. But then the snake is this like primal, instinctive grounding. And then also, like, I don't know why I just think of snake. I just think of rivers and like the waters of life. And
well, then you also have the serpent of the Garden of Eden again,
right?
And that whole question. I mean, it's very disturbing to think of that as being in some way or another a manifestation of Christ. But there is this concept of Lucifer, which means the light bearer. Right. Who was supposedly one of the favored angels of, let's say, the monad, if you like.
Right.
Right. And that he, the interesting thing, the other thing that was really resonant in what you said of this story is when God breathed this wind, let's say, over the false world, that everyone within it was terrified and at the same time inspired to kind of emulate, which is an exact parallel to what Rudolf Steiner says about the Luciferian impulse. That the Luciferian impulse is kind of the impulse of the ancient civilizations, where there was an effort on the part of societies, collective, to become as divine as possible. That we were going to reach. It's very much like the story of the Tower of Babel. That we were going to become as divine as gods,
most high,
yeah, most high. So and it was that hubris and arrogance that created the let's say the tragedies that happened as a result. Really, I think you could point to that painting that you were just showing me. What's the name of the artist?
Piero della Francesca.
Yeah, and it's a painting of the flogging of Christ. Right.
But it's interesting that it's like the structural dynamic of the painting is like, you've got almost two sides of the painting, and the flagellation is like recessed and like background,
Yeah.
to this like seemingly casual, philosophical or business interaction going on between the three guys in the front, like just an average day.
So the flogging is actually rendered in a lot less detail, and there are three figures who are well dressed, you could say.
They're almost like fashionistas,
and they're outside of the little room that the flogging is taking place in. So the room where the flogging is taking place is sort of dim. It's a little more
despite the fact that it's like this white marble room, it's like in the dark in a way.
Yeah. Well, it's not out in the sun, right?
Right.
So there's that realism to it, but it also seems to be symbolically suggesting that this is something that is happening but isn't really being paid attention to.
Right. And it's also almost secondary to the architecture of the pillars and the like religious structure per se,
which is exactly how societies behave.
Totally.
I mean, they always ignore their injustices and tend to, de-emphasize the significance of things that would portray them in a negative light, and focus on, nice clothes and look at the beautiful architecture that, and kind of keeping busy with that stuff. Like that's what we're really doing here is we're building nice places within which terrible things occur.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking about the breath being breathed on the false underworld and that combination of terror and inspiration, just the way you kind of recapitulated it, just reminds me of my own experience. I mean, here we are living out in, the boonies in Southern Oregon, and, it's peaceful and stuff. I'm not having like a life or death crises every day like I used to when I lived in New York City. But there is a strange, it's like the terrifying dynamics of the human politics not being like the forefront of your world, and then also like your whole environment is this like human architecture with a few token trees, but there's something about the what I feel to be this like horribly oppressive environment and nature, and then like all these tormented humans stacked on top of each other, that for some reason that forces the light out of me, or I don't know if you can call it light, but forces me to be creative, because it's like a survival instinct of some kind that like I don't have that like or I don't often experience that like crisis, like you gotta fucking digest this and spit it out in some better way, or just spit the evil out so you can like hear it and it's not inside of you. Not that everything in the city's evil, but
right.
There's a lot of
so you're saying that you don't feel that same urgency out here,
right? Because it's not, there's humans out here. We still live in a, it's not like we're in old growth forests.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of that left, but there's way more trees than people. There's definitely like it's like the land's only been raped here since like the 1850s,
right,
instead of like the 1600s.
Right.
And the human impact doesn't seem, there's a lot of aspects of like,
it's still pretty significant.
Yeah, and it's sad.
Very widespread. It's more widespread than one would
impact.
think. When I first moved to Oregon, I thought that I was moving to like untouched wilderness,
right?
And it took only a few months for me to realize, well,
everything's been logged at least once.
It's all.
And it was pretty rough.
And there's companies who have laid claim to.
Oh, and
it's all carved up. Let's put it that way. Yeah, it's all
dynamic here.
Yeah, the mining goes way back, and
like just the amount of topsoil they blew all over the place and sent down into the ocean, and it's like centuries of nutrients.
And you see glory holes all over the place out in the woods.
But like
here.
even those like rocks are fucking beautiful. They're not
That's
like
true.
concrete squares that all look the same.
That's true. Absolutely.
Even the remains of the like hydraulic mining is like still has some element of like, it's not as beautiful as like the topsoil with the life it would have had, but it's like, the underside of nature is pretty inspiring too.
That's absolutely true.
Zen and
Yeah.
we didn't really need to focus on it, but now that it's here, I mean,
Well, there is something
appreciate
about even seeing like, how would you say this? Like industrial processes that deal with raw materials. There's something about it's like, oh, wow, you're getting down to some kind of base reality there. Even though some of the byproducts of that can be really horrible and destructive, there's something fascinating about it. But, this whole like urban centric civilization now, like one of the things that's struck me recently is so many of these cities now are having the hardest time. The cities are really, it seems, becoming, even just in the United States, we see places like LA, I mean, particularly on the West Coast, we got LA, San Francisco, and Seattle as being these.
Portland's getting pretty big too, man.
And
Don't
Portland
forget
too.
about Portland.
And yeah, but having serious problems with, homelessness and just sort of urban decay, I guess you'd say. There seems to be an awful lot of decay in the cities. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people on the right will say, well, that's because they're Democrat-run cities. And I don't know how many like medium-sized cities are seeing the same kind of thing. I mean, Medford's always been a shithole, so it's kind of hard to judge. Yeah, like whether it's getting worse or not.
I almost feel bad for Medford because they get so much shit. And I mean,
It's
Grants
true.
Pass too, but Grants Pass has actually grown on me where I'd rather go there than Medford. Just
Hell
'cause
yeah.
I don't know what it is, but maybe there's like, I don't know.
There's just something about like there are places in the world where things are hard, but still the people have some spirit left, and it feels like it's like in Medford, people's
It's
spirits.
less redneck.
It's less redneck in Medford.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Or it's like more working class redneck, whereas like Grants Pass is more like Oregonian redneck. Like,
Yeah.
that's just my like.
Grants Pass seems to have more like kind of. It feels a little more
woodsy.
like and some kind of roots. There's some kind of roots and some spirit there that's still
like
alive.
Or maybe Medford being the seat of Southern Oregon after Jacksonville gave up the title. Maybe it's like more business oriented, whereas Grants Pass has had a little less of that, or maybe more of the religious influence. I mean, I was just driving through Murphy today and thinking about, New Hope, that's called that because like the church,
Right.
Or I imagine this may
Probably, yeah.
But and yeah, it's sometimes I forget that like, oh shit, the people who came out here a lot of them were religious, and like at least the organized ones who like set up, the closest thing to public facilities
Right.
early on. And
I think it is true that places that were more business oriented would tend to be less religious tolerant, let's say. Or, I mean, it's easier to be a businessman if you don't have to abide by religious limitations, right?
Totally. No trip ups.
So, yeah, it's like you basically, the range of behaviors that you can engage in is wider.
Right.
For better or worse. So it would make sense that Medford would probably have more of that bigger city feel,
Right. But it's ironic too, because it's like not, I don't know, I'm used to the East Coast cities that are just so dense because they're, engineered before the automobile, and it's like Medford's just so damn spread. I mean,
yeah, it's a sprawl.
All the cities around here, I mean, they all just remind me of mountain towns because they kind of are. But
yeah,
my
they all
first
started as
introduction to a mountain town would have been like, places in Colorado, like Breckenridge, and I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Colorado, but it's like more of that feel than like, West Coast, like city, because it is that mountain thing. Anyways, I'm just babbling about really personal takes.
That's what you do on a podcast, really. I mean, what else do people do? but babble. And we're living in Babylon, so it's appropriate to babble on and brabble on. Maybe that's what this podcast should have been called. Babble on and Babylon.
Babylon, bro.
But yeah, I think that overall sense of one of the things that I notice is living out here, there's a sense of losing, like, you're no longer going to be relevant with respect to what's going on in the sort of more dense population zones.
Oh yeah.
That, and it seems like cities have a tendency to change more quickly, right? And so the mindset of the people tends to go through these, maybe not particularly deep, but still relatively significant changes.
There's like more receptivity to the spirit of change almost.
But it's also like whatever's going on, you have to remain relevant to it because you have to stay in the game. You can't afford to drop out of the game in a city, right?
Right.
I mean, I guess some people do, but it's a rough ride, right?
Yeah.
And that's to some extent, I guess, what explains the homeless situation. There's a bunch of people who dropped out of the game,
Couldn't get back up, and they still ran to nature, but all they could find was the like little triangle in the off ramp.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
But hell, there's still nature there, and it's like
that's true.
Probably speaking to them, when I gotta say myself, I'm just of course jumping right into alcohol problems, but like it's like there's something really humbling when you're like fucking kneeling on the ground vomiting, and you're like, shit, how often do I fucking kneel down and have like all four arms on the ground, and like this is one of the earthiest connections I got, and like, man, some people do this like at least once a week.
Wow.
A lot of people,
that's
trying to get by in those little triangle woods in the cities. And
I was friends with a homeless guy in New York, and he didn't find a little green spot, but he had a pretty significant amount of stuff that people had given him that he would lay out on the pavement and sell, like magazines and CDs and odds and ends, whatever, And he was
entertainment goods.
Was that
entertainment goods?
Yeah, a lot of books and whatever. And he was a super friendly, talkative, really big guy, big
personality,
big guy, big personality, and physically big.
Uh-huh.
And he said that at some point he just made a choice that he'd rather do this than, keep going in the rat race, basically.
Right.
And it was obviously a rough life, but he did genuinely seem to kind of enjoy that decision. I think that's probably not true for many, but I don't think there's a lot of people who enjoy the decisions whether they're in the rat race or not, It seems like it's pretty rough both ways. So,
right, in a way, it's like physically rough is like, I don't know, it's just I feel like there's an element of like visceral struggle that's like, when you rise above it or get past it, or even when you're in it and not above it, it's so more real.
Yeah.
And like you feel more like the hero trying to pull out of something. And
it's also, in that kind of an instance, it's your choice. You're
right.
You're making a decision to deal with hardship so that you're, at least on some level free, because otherwise you're just doing someone else's shit.
Right. You're just following orders.
Right.
And sometimes those orders are just like so confusingly, undertones and expectations that are never like really vocalized fully. And there's that like anxiety in there too of like, okay, I'm supposed to be doing something, but it's not clear. And here, okay, I'm contributing to the collective, and I'm like, okay, all right, yeah, I'm achieving, I'm productive. Productive's good. Yeah, we gotta make more of the good stuff.
It's like you're dealing with a mind fuck. That's basically what it is. It's like most jobs have a huge component of mind fuck involved.
Yeah, existentialism.
Yeah, and like the power play dynamics and all this kind of hierarchy, pecking order, and competition and the sort of frenemy kind of things that end up being a big influencing thing as to whether or not you're going to get that next step up the ladder.
Well, you need a rival in order to grow. That's like the
there's
the
that
myth,
too.
right?
Is it a myth? I don't know.
Maybe
I'm
it's
not
real.
sure.
I don't know.
Well, I don't know. For some reason, the thing that jumps to mind is that whole story of what is it, Enkidu, and it's a story of a king and a wild man, and they have this fight basically, and I think they're basically unable to defeat each other, and so they become the best of friends, and they go adventuring around the world, causing all kinds of mayhem. And it's a story kind of the eventual taming of the wild man. I think Enkidu is the wild man, if I remember correctly.
Enkidu.
Enkidu's kind of wild.
Yeah, I've heard of Enki, but I haven't heard of Enkidu.
But even back then, so this is an ancient story where you're talking about kind of like the man of the city and the man of nature, and as being a fundamental rivalry,
Right. But even at that point, it was like urbanization was taking off, and like the wild man was losing his opportunities to embrace the wildness, and so there's this constant compromise that kind of happens. But like no matter how urban things get, there will always be some element of the wild man, even if he's just like, slinging magazines on the sidewalk that people give him. Well,
that's the weird thing about the time that we're living in now, is like the cities seem to be, I don't know whether it's realistic to say that what we're seeing here on the West Coast is something that is happening globally, but I know that a lot of people who can are getting the hell out of the big cities, right? And so a lot of the people who are most city oriented are getting out of the cities and going to either like smaller cities, or there's this sort of, I guess a lot of business now can just be done online. Everyone's discovered like, hey, you can, get therapy done online. You can go to school online. You can have meetings online instead of traveling. It's like, why did we need to have these office buildings and all be crammed into cities? What's the point? So the cities in some way seem like they're becoming increasingly irrelevant. I don't know whether that's like a long-term trend or not, but it seems quite likely. It would make sense, particularly if, the pandemic goes on forever. Right. The denser populations are going to become ever more of a liability. And so in that sense, we're going to see a very bizarre kind of we've already had this continual influx of essentially urbanites into, let's say, the wildland urban interface, basically moving further and further out into the country. Those who are successful quite often will try to find a piece of land out there somewhere. And so there's more and more development of the forefront, of the frontiers of rural areas from the mindset of the people who are from the cities.
Oh yeah.
And in a way I'm like a transplant from an urban environment, basically.
We're both urban refugees.
Yeah, we're urban refugees.
Like, man, what the fuck is real?
Right.
Trees are real. Water. Real creeks.
What you just said there, I think that actually is kind of the impetus for my whole life. Like, what the fuck is real?
Totally.
What the fuck is real? That was like the big question.
Right.
And I kept getting disappointed with like the things that I had hung my hat on and thinking of, oh yeah, this is the real shit. This is it.
Yeah. Or in my experience, they usually don't feel very human when you get the like, this is real moment. It's like usually the human aspect is at least like kind of a minor element,
Well, that brings into question the extent to which humanity belongs on this planet.
Oh shit! Are we going to segue into some alien theory?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, everyone knows that. It's been well treaded.
Yeah, there's enough podcasts.
But there is I guess in a way that kind of gets back to this false world construction type of thing. I mean, on a certain level, you could say it's impossible for society to not construct a false world. Because basically every abstraction is a reduction of the reality of the world.
But, or along the same lines, it's like it really happened. There's really a concrete jungle there now.
That's true.
And like, it's funny. too, you brought up the concept of like the urban decay. And for me, that actually, I grew up, in between army bases and the suburbs, more or less, until I went to college, and then, moved to New York City kind of on a whim, probably mostly based on listening to the Velvet Underground. I was like, oh, this is where it's happening,
so
man.
When did you get there?
I got there post 9/11, so it was
so
a
Velvet Underground
police
were like,
state at that point.
Yeah,
it was like, man, if you want like drugs and horrors, you better, look pretty hard or, start looking online.
Well,
it's all still there, but it's like you can't just like, go to Times Square and like expect to find that kind of stuff.
Right.
But the oppressiveness of the city environment was more the cleanup feel to me. Of course, have the privilege of being like a taller male who's like, not so worried about getting assaulted walking on the sidewalk at night alone. And but it was more the sterility and the pristine cleanliness that I found to be oppressive. And I actually found that the urban decay was like, all right, nature's always gonna win in the end.
Right.
Concrete cracks and crumbles. Moss will always grow.
Right.
The algae and all that shit that stinks in the subway is life.
Like
it might be like
all of their perfection can't mask any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's something when things get to that level where it's all metal and glass and everyone's shoes are spotless and they're even when they're dining, it kind of looks like everything is neat and tidy. Like that's when things are really going to fall apart.
Yeah,
it's
but even
so far away from what's real.
But even those 5-star restaurants have like about the same amount of rats in the basement where they keep all the food as like the cheapo dollar slice on the corner.
I mean, I can't speak to that directly, and I've heard some nightmarish stories about some of the things that were going on down the village, for instance.
It's like just the facade of cleanliness is pretty spectacular.
Well, almost every restaurant is a facade. That's basically what you're walking into.
I mean, literally, that's what facade means, right? It's like
I don't know.
Storefront, more or less. Right?
Yeah, I guess that's right.
It's like architectural, like it's the side that's like kind of presented as like the prime viewing side of a structure. Oh man, we're just getting right back to the roots of words.
That's what it always comes down to. I mean, you can't really talk about anything if you're not talking about words. Because if you just start a conversation, you don't examine the words you're using and the terms and what the resonances are for you and what the resonances are through history, then I mean, how can you really have a conversation now? Particularly in a world where we've gotten so confused about the words,
right?
And the words are slowly like losing their meaning right in front of our eyes.
Totally.
So we have to examine words and terms. I think it's really important. You were talking about before we started recording the word chorus.
Oh yeah, tracing it back to the Greek. Again, my pronunciation's horrible, but chorodia, with that like hard H sound in the beginning, and then it's actually like a reference to the kind of pagan circle dances that would incorporate the singing, in festivals and celebrations, and that it's funny to think too of like Gregorian chorus, where like you've transitioned to a culture where like dancing is like that's an activity of the devil, but we're still going to stand in a circle and sing, right. And there's still a circle element of a lot of those practices, and maybe it's when the church has started getting square that maybe it's the square's fault that we've lost the circle.
Well, it is really interesting that just to kind of jump to another theme that we seem to be touching on from time to time, the whole question of sin is something that people who are spiritually, let's say, struggling are continually being confronted with. The variety, like the slippery slope, I guess you could say. It's like, first you're singing and dancing, the next thing you know, you're taking drugs and fornicating. You know what I mean? Like that's pretty much like the story in the West. That was what the objection was, right? So when the devil's music, blues and rock and roll, started hitting the little Christian towns, everyone was like, this is not going to go well, Yep. And they were right. I mean, you have to admit that basically we saw a dramatic rise in out of wedlock childbirth, and an increasingly, number of failed marriages, and I think a lot of that was because we kind of became a party nation. It was, rock and roll. What does rock and roll mean? Rock and roll means fuck and leave town.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
Hit it and quit it.
And that's what rock and roll bands did,
Yeah. If they were lucky.
If they were lucky. That's what that was the big payoff. Because, you're getting screwed on the record contract.
So this is kind of like one of the psychological
just to finish that thought while you're putting it together, the bands would get screwed by the companies that were promoting them and putting them on tour. And so they would screw the people who were in the audience. That was kind of the deal.
The trickle-down effect.
It was a trickle-down effect, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone gets screwed.
Everyone gets screwed.
In the end, they're probably better off for it, right?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's a dose of reality.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, maybe it's just we think of it as reality because we've lost our sense of what's true and how life really works. So, there's a cynical point of view where you can make a pretty good case and say, well, no, this is just the way it is. It's the way it's always been. The powerful take advantage of the weak and everyone gets screwed. And if you're lucky, you learn how to enjoy it and you become a screwer too, right? Or there is this other idea that no, there is such a thing as justice and fairness, and you can have a society that operates on the basis of, let's say, consent, and where there's a degree of dignity to life, Now, I don't know to the extent to which that latter formulation is something that's ever really fully existed, or is that just like a facade? Is that just like the storefront on a civilization that's just as decadent and depraved as every other civilization? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting too that those two kind of polar takes on things, like either going for the power card or going for the ethics card, are almost both like kind of more like the seemingly conscious, decisions where, like, to me, I find it so redeeming, or like, that those conscious takes are both like terrifying to me, because like there's nothing on the ethical side, there's, you ever heard that quote, there's nothing more terrifying than someone who's 100% convinced that they're changing the world for the good. Right. And I mean, shit, yeah,
terrifying and dangerous.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
And there a lot of people like will play both cards, but you gotta, I mean, the thing that's uplifting or like redeeming to me is like the understanding that like there's people who are completely unconscious of their relationships to both of those, whether or not they're engaging in them to any degree. And that like there's, I don't know, to me, like just, maybe it's because I'm so overly analytical, but like the fact that most humans are like just operating on a compulsion level is like almost like this like saving grace of humanity. Like there's some level that like can't ever fucking just get with the program. Like it's not wired in there, it's just, like chaos will always just fucking come out, and like, whoever thinks they got the program down and implementing, like, however gross and horrible and disgusting chaos might look, it's still this like shake it up thing so that, we don't end up with just like, this conscious, ethical or power tripping kind of perspective on
There's so much in what you just said that I would love to try to explore a bit more.
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm.
No, I mean it's really a difficult thing to describe, But the question of, the thing that you were kind of getting to, I think, at the end was this sense that no matter what impositions are placed, like the plans of our global masters or whatever you want to call them, like
the designers.
Like the program, getting with the program, right?
Yeah.
That they will always fail because there's this sort of fundamental, like most human beings are just going to kind of
like,
transform into some other thing, and I think there's like a lot of evidence to suggest that the idea of imposing order on things always changes the nature of the things that you're trying to impose your order upon. And it's like, I use this example of long-term capital management, which was a hedge fund that was very good at playing the market, and it worked for a while, but what happened is that they were so good at it that they changed the market. It turned into a different beast, and then it became like a massive crisis because they lost so much So and they ended up, I think, having to be bailed out or whatever, but right now, we're facing one of the largest, in my opinion, maybe other people probably see it differently, but we're seeing one of the largest efforts to impose a new order on things.
The digitization of the world.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are involved in it. You could call it, a lot of people are just saying it's the Great Reset or whatever the hell that
Internet of
Klaus Schwab
Things.
is calling it. The Internet of Things. Yeah, everyone's like, not only do we all have one of these devices attached to us at all times. I just pointed to a cell phone.
Oh yeah,
smartphone, not just a cell phone, but also this passport thing, the COVID passport, where you're going to have credentials in order to walk into what was the word? In order to walk into a storefront.
Oh, the facade.
The facade, yeah. In order to enter the facade, you need to have certain credentials now, right?
Right. Yeah,
so,
I'm about to experience that in the raw when I go to San Francisco
maybe we should do a follow-up episode on...
Good thing I got vaccinated, right?
Mike's Frisco experience. What has Frisco turned into now? Like, I know a few escapees, and like back in the day, I had some friends living there. I would go every now and then. It was kind of a fun city there for a while. It was really an interesting place, but I mean, it got to that same thing, what you're talking about in New York, where it was like glass and metal and clean and all that kind of stuff. And right after that, it was right after Silicon Valley had turned it into their little like Google paradise. That's when it turned to literal human feces. That's basically
the
transition point.
For me, my first experience in San Francisco was probably right on that turning point. For me, I was like 18 or 19. I just started college and realized that I'd really wanted to take that year off, convinced the faculty that, they would let me take a year off, which is kind of like not very common, but I just, decided to get a cheap van, live out of my van, go around the country, do the freaking hippie thing and play music on the street. But the only thing I knew about San Francisco was that it was kind of a unique city, and then it was one of the earliest cities to not be run by the mob because they had strong shipping unions. And in the 60s, there was some kind of a flower child movement thing that happened, and it was cool. And I didn't know a whole lot. I probably listened to some like Jefferson Airplane once or twice and heard they're from San Francisco. But then I was going through San Francisco, and my van broke down there, and I was there for like 2 months, and like living on the Buena Vista Park, which is right near Haight Street. And, nothing like I imagine was described in the 60s and 70s. And even the 90s was probably way cooler. But, this would have been 2008. I remember paying a lot of money for gas. Bad time to be road tripping around the country if you're concerned about gas prices. But I, coming from the East Coast and kind of more the police state vibe, it was so uplifting to like, just, I don't know, there's just like a lot of like loafers, you know, that were like not creepy, you know, you know, people that you look at and you're like, oh shit, drug addict, you know. It was like, you know, go sit down on this bench in the park and some dude like looks pretty chill, you know, just comes up and got like a duffel bag and just pulls out a beer and he's like, yo man, you want a beer? I'm like, shit, why not? I'm not like working a job or anything today. And it's like, I mean, I've never been in a city where like a stranger comes up to you and is like, yo, you just want to like chill and like talk about some shit and like drink a beer. Like it's like fucking 2 p.m. on
I mean, it doesn't
Sunday.
happen hardly anywhere.
Yeah, I don't
country,
even know
right?
if it's still like a thing, but and I'd never been in a place where like you just walk down the street and people are like, yo, trees, bro, you want some trees, you know, drinking some reefer, you know. It's like, man, usually gotta look for that shit, but you know, we're in completely different times now.
Oh, New York used to be like that.
Right, yeah. Before the police state thing and
before they cleaned up Times Square, there were guys running around there constantly, like,
yeah,
smoke, you'll smoke.
Yeah, it's like I got caught like right in the middle times where it just sucked, you know. It was like the police state was there, but like weed wasn't legal, and so now I'm gonna feel like a criminal for the rest of my life just because like, you know, it was like not cool.
Yeah, the whole legalization thing is something I have such mixed feelings about. I got to say, it's really part of it is like hard to come to terms with, having spent, you know, all that time seeing it as something that's essentially illegal, you know, and so
yeah, or at least taboo, you know.
Yeah, and
but mostly illegal.
Well, but there's also this, you know, I do think that historically speaking, civilizations that become overly indulgent in sense engagements are on the downward path. So I do think that drugs are really problematic when it comes to having a functional society. Right. You know, and like opening the doors of perception and what have you, it's like all very interesting on a personal level, but when it comes to, you know, people having an agreement about what's going on, I think, you know, it bursts the bubble of the fake world. That's what drugs do, you know? And like basically, if every society is fundamentally a fake world that has its own kind of internal mechanism that allows it to run, well, then, you know, that's one way of it becoming completely dysfunctional, which is maybe what's necessary at a certain point.
Right. It's almost like a corrective element of like you reach a certain point. I think the part, you know, I definitely have mixed feelings too. And I'm someone who's, you know, habitually smoked marijuana since I was like 16 years old. And I took maybe like 1 year off and, you know, I got mixed feelings. Of course I use it as medicine, but like probably more of the time it's like I use it as a, you know, escape, more of like abusive kind of thing. And I've thought about my struggle and I'm like pretty conscious of my struggle. And I didn't grow up around hardly anybody who, you know, smoked weed. You know, of course, everyone's got the weird uncle. You know, I had the weird uncle who smoked weed. And, you know, he helped me out early on. But, you know, I mean, shit, he was the first person I saw who just, like, dropped out of life and went and, like, lived in a cabin. And, like, look at me now. I mean, last time I saw him, he's like, I'm the one who fucked you up, right? Yeah.
Oh, shit.
I'm like, yeah, and you're proud of it too, aren't you?
Oh, shit.
But yeah, when I think about like, you know, how hard it was to like score weed, you know, half of it was like the adventure, you know, early on. And then, you know, it's so weird that, you know, I think it's a great thing that, you know, it's kind of like, you know, higher quality, it's a commodity good now. You test things, make sure it's not pesticides, and like, you know, if you go to a dispensary, you're not going to get weeds laced with PCP or like,
right,
you know, weird shit in there. You never know what happened. And like, I definitely smoked some fucking sketchy ass shit, you know, especially
you know,
East Coast cities. And
yeah, we bought a few bags of oregano when we were kids, you know, which is not a great smoke. You know?
No, it's a headache and a half. But I guess the commodity thing really, I mean, people talk about it being a gateway drug, and I'm like, yeah, it's a gateway drug, but it's also a gateway plant, man. Like, because, you know, I remember growing weed in the little, you know, little teeny section of woods in the, like, drainage area in between some suburban houses, and a pathetic amount that I harvested off this thing that was almost completely all shade, but like it was like, holy shit, I just grew this thing that like I usually would have to like, make some phone calls, meet up with some shady ass people that sketched me out, and like, just didn't like their energy and shit. And it's like, oh man, I just provided for myself. And it was like, I was like, oh man, like food, like you can do this with food and shit too. And like, the process was cool. It wasn't just like, okay, I just produced a commodity good and like I like that shit. It was like, right. Oh man, I'm interacting with this cool living plant. And that was my gateway to like growing plants, and like,
wow,
here I am in Southern Oregon. I've mostly been, kind of plugging in and out of the organic farming world,
right?
Native.
It seems like you try to stay away from the weed scene as much as possible, right?
But like,
you're really interested in the plant world,
right?
Writ
There's
large,
enough. There's enough other people who are like just so psyched on weed, and it's cute as fuck to me, in some instances where it's just like, bro, it's just like, fuck yeah, do this shit. It's amazing. It's like, the fucking shit, and like, people been like, just loving this plant for so long, continuing the lineage, and like,
I think I know the guy who you're doing right now.
Yeah, there's like 10 of them on this road.
There are people who are just
cute,
super,
and it's so real.
That's really nice to see, because there are a whole bunch of different types out there.
Those probably are a minority.
I think they are, yeah.
At least around here, because it is like a business thing, and that's the weird thing. Is like,
well, the thing that worries me is the cartels. That's.
Well, it seems like, the county's been fucking plowing through some shit this year.
Our county has been, but not Josephine. I heard
Josephine's been on some shit.
Really?
Williams got a huge scene at the end of was it Browns Road or Panther Gulch.
When was that?
This spring. They bulldozed a huge operation with like 20 greenhouses. Also out in Cape Junction. And like, I don't think I know enough about the cartel to have like a really strong opinion on their. Well,
there's a bunch of different ones that are operating, as I understand it.
It's just like an umbrella word for like the underground. Again, it's like, full of mixed feelings, because, when I moved out here, can I segue into like a personal story that's kind of a little bit long?
You can segue into whatever the hell you want.
All right. Okay, so like I move out to Oregon, I'm interested in organic farming, all that stuff, and spend a season with my best friend who came out here with me, and we're like, working between two small, diverse, kind of family farm operations, doing animals, a little bit of veggies, and then I go back east to end up at a party my buddy threw, and my high school sweetheart's there, and hadn't seen her in a long time. I'm horrible keeping contact with pretty much everybody in my life, and so it was like this really awesome connecting point. And then, she's been at art school, which, I had dropped out of art school to go do the farming thing, and she kind of made this like jab at me where she's like, why don't you just move down to California and like grow weed like everyone else I went to school with, and it's kind of like, as much as I love that plant, I was kind of like, I really am trying not to get distracted. There's plenty of other people who are passionate about that shit. I kind of want to stick with the food thing. And like, at that point I was like, that ethical drive as a young person, we're like, I'm going to do the thing to change the world. Our food system's like just fucking in tatters. That's like the base of society. We're in denial of the fact that we are still an agricultural society, and it's like small scale ethical farming, that's what's up. And like, not really trying to make fun of that because it's still a reality, but sometimes I think I'm more on the side of like the younger perspective where they're like, yeah, it's fucked, and like you're not gonna fix it, so why try? But shit, in my experience, it's more like it's the real thing. It's not about the like ethics and trying to change reality. It's more like, hey, how can I have experiences that feel real to me and real to share with the people in my life?
Right, in some sense, having a feeling of forward movement, that things are developing, understanding is deepening. This is an enriching path, even if it's not going to be profitable. That's certainly
Right.
the way I've viewed it. And I guess the idea of saving the world is, it's a nice pipe dream, but
Don't be a martyr. Don't be Superman.
I mean, no one's going to save the world.
Right.
It has its own inexorable course to it, and there were people way smarter than we are 100 years ago, who saw it pretty clearly. So it doesn't seem like that's realistic at all. There may be perhaps a massive cataclysm after which there might be a new opportunity.
Right.
But until
the skills could, eventually be, valued by greater society, but
it's not impossible, but as things stand in the present system, I don't see how it could be reformed in a meaningful way that would actually address the issues that we're concerned about.
Yeah, and I've continually stepped back from particularly market gardening and farmers markets and the CSA thing, because I kind of hit a point where I'm like, you know what, this is real, but anything on an even small scale industrial scale is industrial, and I don't know, if I was actually involved in the farmers market, and you're selling to people and experiencing their gratitude in person, it'd be different. But the last farm I was working on, regularly, it was I was providing for a CSA, and we'd pack the CSA boxes, and I kind of hit a point where it's I personally do not know any of these people. These are probably a bunch of young professionals, doctors and educated people who have some ethics and enough income to act on them. And the reality is that most of these people are throwing half of this into the compost, if they have a compost at home, because they don't have time to cook this shit. They're young professionals that have careers and shit, and I don't know any of them, and I don't see the appreciation, and I'm sure they're great people, but I kind of got to a point where I was I want to grow food for people I know, or just take a break for a while. I've kind of segued to more of the native restoration stuff, but again, I'm segueing like crazy. So getting back
That's
to
what
my
we do here on the Assembly of Silence,
right? Well, that conversation I had with my high school sweetheart, it kind of makes this jab, and it was kind of very fortuitous, because the following season, continuing my education in the small scale farming world. At that point I was more focused on organic, which, isn't as relevant to me personally these days. Again, I mean, not certified organic. I think organic practices are more ideal, but I'm not a purist. But the irony was the next season, we moved down here to Southern Oregon to work on a vegetable seed farm. Just happens the town I moved to has the highest per capita card holders for growing marijuana of any town in the entire state. And I find myself in I thought that was just Northern California scene, but I'm in this sea of small scale pot growers, which is kind of cool, because it seems like Northern California, it's more that large scale thing, and it's been going on longer, whereas Williams, when I moved there, it was most people is we got 8 to 16 plants, and we're just a family, raising kids, and we playing music and doing stuff that doesn't make you money, and it's cool that we can work from home and really work really hard for 2 months in the fall, processing this sacred plant, and getting the medicine to the people. And, at first it was whoa, man, this perspective is way different than I'm trying to score some drugs. and seeing what people were doing with that money. It wasn't the drug dealer, like, oh, I'm just gonna get some fucking bling, nothing wrong with that. Gold chain's way more real than investing in the stock market in my book. But yeah, it was just like really uplifting to see, like, oh, whoa, these people aren't trying to get rich. They're just trying not to be like sucked into the career system. And they're like, making cool music and like, custom tie-dye t-shirts and, just all the wacky stuff that like,
So where is it at now?
into.
I mean, it's changed now, right?
Yeah, I mean, with the advent of legalization and industrialization, most of those people who are sticking with it are like, it looks way more like a career path now, where like that's your job and like you got to grow, way more.
Yeah.
I mean, like with the hemp thing, it's like acres.
Yeah,
and like a family can't handle monitoring acres. You gotta like you're in the ag world now. You gotta like hire seasonal help, and like seasonal help is affordable, which is like increasingly like migrant workers or just underpaid largely people of color who are citizens of the states but are more in the ag world. And
well, that's one of the concerns about the cartels is that they're basically using slave labor.
Right.
And I've heard some pretty nasty stories about that,
and that's
but I cannot verify whether they're true or not.
Not appreciate the presence.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of reasons to be concerned about that. Yeah.
It also seems like a lot of the criticism is centered around like having no ethics in regards to like pesticides,
right?
Choice of
well, it seems like one of the themes that we keep kind of running up against here is this question of the extent to which one can reasonably integrate ethics into any operation, including one's own life.
Yeah, because you got to make compromises at every sector, and the more greater society kind of like focuses on production of commodity goods, the more you just constantly have to compromise the ethics in order to like fucking stay afloat.
The song Rhinestone Cowboy?
No.
Glenn Campbell?
Rhinestone or Grindstone?
Rhinestone Cowboy. I can't remember why it came up the other day, but Shang and I looked up the lyrics, and it's like an incredibly cynical song. It has this like really great chorus hook that's very uplifting, I guess you could say. Uh-huh. So it feels like a song that's kind of triumphant in sort of a weird, tawdry way. But
wait, what does tawdry mean?
Like kind of cheap. And like cheesy. Rhinestones are fake diamonds or whatever, right. Like, so
like bedazzle.
Yeah, it's sort of like an Elvis suit or something like that. That's basically, so the star who's, Tinseltown type of deal. And there's a line in it where he says there'll be a load of compromising on the road to my horizon. Something like that. It's a terrible rhyme.
But it's the almost rhymes that are better.
I guess so, opinion,
yeah. Like it's like if you're like a spot on rhyme, then it's like, oh shit, that's just predictable.
That's true. You gotta kind of push things one direction or another. But I wasn't really mentioning it for its poetic content.
Right. Sorry.
It was more like
digressing.
This notion of the compromise and as an essential part of the life path in order to make it one way or another.
Right.
And that also, I think, comes back to the religious question. Like, the religious town is less likely to do business in, like, the broadest sense of the term because they won't compromise on certain things. They have ethical principles that they would hold to. And that is sort of the, conservative perspective. It's something that is built into some of the basic concepts of law and justice and that sort of thing. And the terrible thing about the slippery slope that we're on is that all of the things that make for a world that isn't the worst case scenario are gradually being eroded. And you end up with a society that's fundamentally gangsta criminal when like all of the ethical principles have been compromised. And I think we have been sliding down that slope for a long time now, and it's hard to say whether we ever weren't already completely decadent. Is it just a facade and a myth that we had a law-abiding, God-fearing nation? I mean, I think on some level it's like always a matter of percentages. There's
but it's like
there's currents within society, and so there are people who still abide by a set of principles on some way or another. Different principles depending upon what they believe in. But, if you believe in the law, or if you believe in God's law, or there's a wide range of other things that one can believe in, but having a set of principles is a pretty fundamental thing to having, I think, a coherent life and having a coherent society where people just aren't screwing each other over all the time.
Right.
And so that's the price that we've paid for a lot of the indulgence in the liberties in this country, well, around the world.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about like the myth of the ethics that this country was founded on. Because recently I was reading kind of all-in-one history of the United States. I think Jill Lepore might have been the name of the woman who wrote the book, and it was really phenomenal just how much she touched on in the book. But I was really surprised to find out that the One Nation Under God thing on the dollar bill, that didn't exist until like the 1920s or something with the temperance movement, or maybe like late 1800s, but it was a later development. And they actually say that the time that the Declaration of Independence was written was one of the most secular times in American history, and that really these guys were high on like the Roman and Greek formation of the republics, and it was the ethics were really not that concerned with religious qualities per se, so much as like the people. But then again, these people's, or the general consensus amongst the elite of who was a person, was pretty skewed.
All right, I'm going to kick her out so that we can... Hey!
As go. Was, in Rome and Greece.
Go. Well, apparently, if I understand correctly, they were high not only on some of the ideas from the classic world, but they were also high on hemp.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Totally, but it didn't have the kick that it has now.
No, it was a totally different.
Yeah, it was way chiller. You could still talk about politics after you smoked weed. Do you mind if I just say one more thing about the founding forefathers? This is another book I read recently that, of course, I'm not going to remember the author's name, but it was a book on the history of the development of waterways in the United States, and the general sentiment that the author expressed was that the gatherings that led up to the Declaration of Independence would have never happened if George Washington wasn't trying to establish a canal system on the Potomac for commercial business reasons, and that he couldn't get Maryland and Virginia to agree on whatever licenses he needed to put in this canal system for his own personal profit. And so he wanted to make a national government so that he could bypass the states, or at least come to some compromise more than they had figured out on their own.
Interesting.
And so that
wouldn't have even involved interference from the crown or anything. It was just the lack of willingness on the part of different states to play ball.
Yeah, they weren't willing to
Well, you never know what's going to inspire, change. It's not always necessarily the most noble or ethical consideration, right? And we could say that maybe that was a foretelling of what this nation would be.
Right. Well, when you're talking about the ethics versus kind of the power trip, in my mind, I'm kind of like, well, maybe there's the ethics of power. That's its own category of ethics, is the world as is. What can you do? Where's you know.
Well, that would be more of like a pragmatic kind of, maybe more real politic, like the physics of power.
Right.
Something along those lines.
But that
It has its own set of logical kind of operations that you can't pretend are otherwise.
right. It's like contains an ethics of its own.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the word ethics, but maybe we'd have to explore the word ethics. But we did just have people returning to the space here.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
They're doing a great job of being quiet. But one of the things that is wonderful about doing an in-person Assembly of Silence episode is that we have the option to do what Judah and I call the Assembly of Silence moment, which involves creating atmospheric noises to signal that the conversation has reached its end point, and we throw it into a little bit of reverb, and that's the way we ride it out here. What do you say?
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.